Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're jumping into quite a significant topic, the genetics of autism.
Yes, it's a field that's seen, well, a huge shift in understanding over the years.
Absolutely. And think of this as a journey, maybe a bit like your UPSC prep, digging into complex information, trying to piece it all together.
That's a good way to put it. We're drawing heavily from a BBC report today, so it's well-sourced stuff.
Good. So our aim here is to really unpack the genetics, but also how it, interacts with other factors, give you that nuanced view.
Exactly. And we'll try to keep it clear, regardless of your background knowledge. No oversimplification, but clarity.
Okay, so where do we start? Maybe with the history. That refrigerator mother idea.
Yeah, we have to touch on that, unfortunately. It casts such a long shadow. Came about in the 1940s, Leo Kanner.
Hard to imagine now blaming parents like that. Cold parenting causing autism.
It really is. And what's striking is how long it took to really debunk it. It caused immense pain and guilt for families based on, well, no real evidence.
So much unwarranted blame. What was the turning point then? When did things start to shift?
Science, basically. Rigorous science. The big moment was probably 1977.
Ah, the twin study.
That's the one, a landmark study by psychiatrists. It was really the first solid piece of evidence pointing towards genes being involved.
And that really set the stage for where we are now, didn't it? The genetic link is considered very strong today.
Incredibly strong. Later studies, especially more twin research, just solidified it.
What kind of numbers are we talking about?
Well, look at identical twins. If one has autism, the chance the other does is like over 90%.
Wow, over 90%.
Yeah. Compare that to fraternal twins, same sex, it drops to around 34%.
Still higher than the general population, though.
Oh, much higher. General population risk is about 2.8%. So that huge gap between identical and fraternal twins, that screams genetics.
Right. It points to a really powerful biological predisposition in many cases.
Definitely. Which is why genetic research became such a priority.
So genetics plays a huge role, clearly. But it's not like one single autism gene, is it? It's more complicated.
Oh, much more complicated. That brings us into the genome itself. The genetic difference between any two people is tiny, about 0.1%.
Seems minuscule.
It is. But as Thomas Bergeron over at the Institut Pasteur puts it, these tiny variations can have no effect, a small effect, or sometimes
a super strong effect.
Exactly his term, super strong. And these are the ones we see in maybe up to 20% of autism cases.
So in those cases, a single gene mutation has a really major impact on brain development.
Precisely. And Bergeron stresses this often links to other significant challenges, things like intellectual disability, motor delays, sometimes epilepsy.
So it's a different picture than maybe the common perception of autism sometimes. These are profound effects.
Very profound. And we've identified at least 100 genes where these kinds of mutations can happen. It's like a critical error in the blueprint, not just a minor typo.
And Professor Bergeron himself made a key discovery early on.
He did, back in 2003, found mutations in 2 genes involved in synaptogenesis.
Synaptogenesis, that's the brain-forming connections.
Right, the brain's wiring. Crucial process. So finding genes involved there was a big step.
Did that get a lot of attention at the time?
Interestingly, no, not really. Bergeron mentioned it was kind of drowned out by other big world news. Shows how science can progress quietly sometimes.
Yeah, it does. So these big impact mutations, where do they come from? Always inherited.
Not always. That's where de novo variants come in.
De novo, meaning new.
Exactly. Professor Geschman calls it like a bolt of lightning. A random mutation happens in the embryo. It wasn't in the parent's DNA.
Ah, okay. But sometimes they are inherited.
Yes, they can be. Sometimes from a parent who doesn't actually have autism themselves.
Right, that seems confusing. How does that work?
Well, Geschman explains it like this. In the parent, maybe that one mutation isn't enough on its own to cause autism.
Okay.
But in the child, that same big mutation might combine with other smaller effect gene variants inherited from both parents.
Ah, like an additive effect.
Precisely. The combination crosses a threshold, influencing neurodevelopment differently, like adding several small ingredients that change the whole dish.
Got it. So even with these super strong genes, it can still be a mix of factors.
Often is. And of course, genetics isn't the only factor. There's the environment, too.
Right. That 10% difference in identical twins proves that.
Exactly. Environment plays a role. But we need to be cautious here. Avoid going back to discredited ideas.
Like the vaccine theory, which, sadly, still pops up despite being thoroughly debunked.
Unfortunately, yes. And you mentioned Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s recent research effort. It's worth noting the Autism Society of America raised concerns about its scientific basis. It just shows how sensitive this still is.
It really does. So what are the plausible non-genetic factors researchers are looking at?
The NIH points to a few areas, things like prenatal exposure to significant air pollution, maybe certain pesticides. Also, factors around birth itself, being born extremely prematurely, or difficulties during birth that might lead to oxygen deprivation. These are active research areas.
So back to the genetics. When during development, do these genes seem to exert their main influence?
Research points strongly to early brain development, specifically the formation of the cortex.
The cortex, that's the higher level functions part of the brain.
That's right. Thinking, learning, social stuff. And the key window seems to be between about 12 and 24 weeks of fetal development.
A critical period.
Very critical. Geschwin uses that analogy. Again, mutations can kind of knock development off its normal track during this time.
Understanding all this, the specific genes involved, it must have some positive impacts.
Oh, absolutely. For one, it's allowed families to connect. Finding other parents whose children have the same rare gene mutation, that creates vital support networks.
Like the Family SCN2A Foundation you mentioned.
Exactly. Knowing the specific gene, like SCN2A, allows that connection.
And does this genetic information have implications for, say, future family planning?
It's being discussed. Especially with de novo variants, the risk of it happening again is very low, which can be reassuring.
And maybe give families a better sense of what to expect.
Potentially, yes. A clearer understanding of the possible developmental path.
But this also leads into more complex territory, doesn't it? Ethical concerns.
Definitely. There's significant concern within parts of the autistic community about how this genetic data might get used.
Fears about prenatal testing.
Yes, specifically fears that it could lead towards eugenics. Some activists even track what they call the autistic genocide clock, referencing termination rates after prenatal diagnoses of conditions like Down syndrome.
It's a really strong reaction.
It highlights the depth of the fear. Sue Fletcher-Watson, a researcher, points out that these fears aren't always given enough attention, especially in the current political climate.
It's a difficult balance. Okay, so moving towards therapies. How is this genetic knowledge guiding research there?
Well, particularly for those cases linked to single high-impact genes, sometimes called profound autism.
Which the Lancet Commission recognized as a term recently, right?
Yeah.
For those needing constant support.
Yes, exactly. So for those individuals, the logic is, if one gene copy is faulty, maybe we can target that.
Oh.
Geschwin's lab, for instance, is looking at ways to boost the activity of the healthy copy of the gene.
Compensating for the faulty one.
Kind of. And Bourgeron's trial using lithium for kids with SHANK3 mutations is another example, targeting the specific pathway affected by that gene.
And even more futuristic ideas. Gene editing.
People like Geschwin are talking about the potential for CRISPR, maybe even for in utero interventions down the line. It's very forward-looking.
But we are seeing actual trials starting now.
Yes. Jaguar Gene Therapy got FDA approval for a trial for kids with SHANK3 mutations and Phelan-McDermid syndrome.
That sounds significant.
It is. And as Joseph Buxbaum points out, these trials are only possible because we now have the genetic diagnoses and detailed natural history data, understanding how these specific conditions progress over time.
But is everyone convinced these are really autism therapies?
That's a point of debate. Fletcher-Watson suggests they might be better described as treatments for associated conditions, like intellectual disability, rather than autism itself.
Interesting distinction.
She is more optimistic, though, about using genetic insights to treat co-occurring conditions often seen with autism, like epilepsy or severe sleep problems.
Okay. And Bourgeron is also working on broader projects.
Yes, he's leading a big European project looking at risk, resilience, and diversity. Importantly, working with autistic people and families.
Collaboration seems key there.
Crucial.
Now, we've spent a lot of time on these rare, high-impact genes. What about most autistic people, where it's not one single gene?
Right, that's the majority. And the current thinking is that for most, neurodiversity comes from the combined effect of many, maybe hundreds or thousands, of common gene variants.
Inherited from both parents.
Yes. Each variant on its own might have only a tiny effect on brain development.
But add them all up.
And collectively, they shape how the brain develops and functions in a way that leads to an autistic profile.
And the parents carrying these common variants might show some traits themselves, but not be autistic.
Exactly. Maybe they're very detail-oriented or find social cues a bit harder to read or have strong pattern recognition skills, milder expressions of traits.
How do researchers even identify these subtle common variants?
It's complex. Tools like Simon Baron-Cohen's Reading the Mind in the Eyes test, which measures emotion recognition, have been used.
Combined with big genetic data sets,
Yeah,
like from 23andMe.
precisely. Combining trait measurements with huge genetic databases allows them to find statistical links.
And what are the patterns they're finding with these common variants?
It's fascinating, actually. They tend to correlate negatively with things like empathy and social communication skill.
Okay, that might fit some stereotypes, but
But they often correlate positively with systemizing the drive to analyze or build systems. Think engineering, math, music.
so potential strengths linked to the same variants.
Yes. And these gene variants are also often linked with higher educational achievement and certain talents.
So Geschwin suggests they stick around in the gene pool because they might offer advantages.
That's his thinking. It challenges that purely deficit view of autism genetics. Maybe some of these genes contribute to valuable skills and perspectives.
Makes you think about neurodiversity and evolution. Are researchers also looking at why autism seems more common in males?
They are. Geschwin and Baron-Cohen are working on that right now. Sex differences and also masking.
Masking, like hiding autistic traits.
Yeah, the idea that autistic women might be better at consciously or unconsciously masking their traits, which could lead to underdiagnosis.
So understanding that might reveal maybe protective factors or different developmental pathways.
Potentially, though, again, the idea of intervention based on that is still part of that bigger, more complex discussion.
Which really brings us back to that core tension, doesn't it? Is autism something to be treated or a difference to be accepted?
That's the fundamental debate. And you hear strong views, like Sue Fletcher Watson saying autism isn't like cancer, something everyone agrees is bad and needs a cure. She believes it never will be seen that way universally.
A powerful statement.
It is. And then you have someone like Bougeron, who acknowledges the real challenges some face, but also strongly advocates for recognizing neurodiversity.
Creating a society where different ways of functioning are supported.
Exactly. Tailoring support to individual needs and strengths, allowing everyone to flourish.
This has been, well, incredibly insightful. We've gone from those old, damaging theories to this really complex picture of genes, environment, rare variants, common variants.
And the huge societal questions that come with that knowledge.
Absolutely. And for you listening, particularly those preparing for UPSC, grappling with this kind of scientific and social complexity, weighing different viewpoints, thinking about ethical implications, these are crucial skills. This is a perfect case study.
And remember, our main source for this was a detailed report from the BBC, worth checking out if you want to read more.
Definitely. So if you found this deep dive helpful, please do like, subscribe, maybe leave a comment if you have questions or thoughts. We appreciate the engagement.
And maybe a final thought to leave you with. As genetic research advances, not just in autism, but across the board, how do we as a society balance this growing knowledge with respect for human difference and the rights of individuals? How do
Okay.
we build societies that are truly inclusive?